you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you to Sarah and Rose for inviting me to talk here today. My name is Phil Bird. I'm a researcher at the University of Leicester. I'm working on the Met for Tech project. This is focused on technology metals, but is part of the UK's broader circular economy research program called NICER. And today I would like to talk to you about technology metals and the challenges in quantifying the geological stocks of these resources. There we go. So our technological infrastructure now utilizes a greater diversity of metals than at any point in history, with over 40 metals being considered critical to maintaining our social and industrial structures. The diversification in metal use has occurred at the same time as a rapidly expanding global middle class and increased patterns of consumption that have driven the demand for metals ever higher. So many of these metals, such as tellurium, indium, scandium, some of them are highlighted in red, possess unique properties that facilitate specialized uses in electronics, magnets, advanced alloys, etc. And in individual applications only require very small quantities. For example, the touchscreen of a smartphone has a 0.01 grams of indium in it on the surface coating. But these specialized properties also limit potential substitution, and many of these elements are extracted from the earth as byproducts of other mining activities. So what do I mean by that? Well, in general, the current mining paradigm is focused on a high value or high volume main product, such as copper, aluminium, or iron. You're being extracted from the ground, beneficiated, and shipped for refining. This block of ore, though, will contain other elements in addition to the main product, and some of these are of interest to the mining companies. For example, copper ores commonly also yield gold and silver, and these are called co-products. But the remaining elements, which include many of these technology metals, are generally not of interest to the mining companies. In fact, they might actually be penalized if their ore is too rich in these elements when it's shipped to the refiner. The refiner, though, is able to recover these elements in the process and sell them at a profit. For example, tellurium is recovered from copper ores as a necessary step in purifying gold concentrates. And many of the elements that are now essential parts of our technology are recovered mainly as byproducts. This diagram shows companionality of elements, that is, how much of their supply is from the mining of another metal. And the elements within the red circle, these ones are of particular concern because greater than 50% of their supply is dependent on another commodity. So, for example, selenium and tellurium in the bottom half of the diagram are entirely dependent on copper for their production. The dependence on another commodity can potentially cause challenges to the supply of these metals, with increasing demand not necessarily translating to an increased supply if the demand for the main product is not increasing. And this is a problem because the demand for many of these metals, tellurium, selenium, cadmium, etc., is only expected to grow. And that's because many of these high companionality byproduct elements are essential for technologies integral to the green transition, and we need a lot of these metals. The UK strategy for net zero and electrification of the internal combustion fleet will require an estimated 10 years of current neodymium and dysprosium production, 2 years of annual cobalt production, and that might be achievable if it was just the UK, but every industrialized nation is doing the same thing. So we need decades worth of global supplies of these metals, and we need them as soon as possible. And one suggestion people brought up recently is recycling. It's a hot topic, and there have been many calls recently for us to stop mining the earth and to instead mine e-waste. But we need many times more of these materials than has ever been mined. And unfortunately, for many of the elements, the current applications are in a form that is simply not amenable to recycling. So for now, we need to carry on mining. But there is a fundamental lack of knowledge regarding the stocks and flows of byproduct elements. The diagram here shows a model estimating the cumulative flow of tellurium from copper mining and refining over the course of the 20th century. The majority of tellurium has been lost, with only 4% of the estimated potential resource making it to the market. The important point, however, is actually that this is an estimate, and in truth, there are no good models for either primary tellurium resources, and also the data on the efficiency of recovery is highly contradictory. And what is the problem with this? Well, it has some really serious impacts. It limits attempts to improve recovery efficiency in active deposits. It limits our ability to conduct long-term economic planning. It limits the flexibility of supply. We do not know where a lot of these elements are, and we're currently relying on only a few small sources. And unfortunately, it results in countries with these resources unknowingly exporting their critical elements, which they may need for their own green projects. And they get almost no remuneration for this. And often, in fact, they will have to pay a penalty on these elements. Regrettably, the net flow of material is also from less developed to more developed countries. So for example, Belgium is one of the leading suppliers of tellurium and selenium in the world, despite having no native copper deposits of its own. So why don't companies produce models for these byproduct elements? Well, if you examine technical reports for active mines or deposits that are being currently explored, you'll find that the collection of multi-element data, including many critical elements, is conducted as standard. So on the diagram here is for the Pebble Deposit, which is a multi-million ton copper deposit in Alaska, and it's the history of its exploration for its technical reports. And you'll be able to see that from the earliest days of the projects, they were conducting geochemistry that included technology elements such as tellurium, selenium, rhenium, but they were not publishing estimates for the resource. It was always focused on gold, copper, and molybdenum. And the Pebble Deposit is interesting because following the publication of the US's 2018 critical minerals list, which included rhenium for the first time, they actually produced in their next technical report an estimate for a rhenium resource. And they did this by using archived geochemical data and limited geochemical modeling. And they were able to present a rhenium resource of 2,615 tons, which is enough for 44 years of annual rhenium supply. So if the necessary data is there and it's widely available, why don't we see more critical element resources from these large copper deposits or other similar deposits? Well, reporting of reserves and resources is governed by a number of national and supranational codes who have strict definitions for what can and cannot be classed and reported as a resource. And while there are multiple restrictions, such as concepts around materiality and public interest, fundamentally, it comes down to one of value. All the codes, and here is some of the language they use, require that a resource has reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. And unfortunately, in the case of the byproducts, that just isn't the case from the perspective of the mining company. Here, the distribution of value in ore material from selected porphyry copper deposits is displayed. And you can see that gold and copper, less frequently molybdenum, dominate the value of metals contained within the ore. And in fact, all of the byproduct elements combined account for less than 1% of the total value of metals in the ore. A common refrain is that as demand increases, the price will go up and people will explore for and mine these metals. But when you consider that gold and tellurium, for example, occur at similar concentrations in these deposits, the price of tellurium would need to increase to something similar to levels of gold for it to be of real interest to a mining company. And at that price, all but the richest nations and customers will be excluded from any technology that would be related to it. So if they are such low value, how are they ever recovered? Well, as I said earlier, the refiner doesn't have to pay for the cost of extracting and processing the ore. And in fact, it charges mining companies a penalty for having to purify their gold. And some people might be thinking, well, some mines have their own refining facilities, and yes, they do. And they produce some byproduct elements, but it is only ever as part of purifying the main prey product. Much of the critical element resource is likely lost much earlier in the process, to tailings or to waste. Because when they are mining a deposit, they will follow the copper grade rather than mining a block that contains significant byproduct element but no copper. So what do we do to address this problem? Well, there have been suggestions that we need to update the reporting codes to allow the reporting of selected critical resources, even if they are not economic from the perspective of a reporting company, but they do align with the national interest of the host nation. Even if this was achieved, and that would be a big task, it may require incentivization to get companies to report these elements, the construction of resource estimates being expensive and time consuming. But it is something we desperately need to do, because without a better knowledge of the resource base, we are going to struggle to not only find these materials, but guarantee a long-term supply for them. So thank you everyone for listening. I'm happy to discuss anything anyone would like to about this. Please look for Met4Tech in the future. Some really interesting research across multiple disciplines is taking place regarding technology metals. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Phil. Absolutely brilliant. Round of applause. Awesome. Rose, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I know I haven't given you a heads up. Do you have anything that you want to ask to Phil? Because I know that you recognize some of the diagrams, for example, that he was showing in his presentation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Phil. That was it's really interesting seeing my diagram used. And the topic being explored a little bit more. Do you think that this is something that the mineral resource and reserve codes need to look at, like CRISCO or those bodies, or is this something that needs to be done from a national level or from a company level? So when I've looked at this, it's interesting because they're global targets, right? And the idea of critical mineral from governments. And then we expect companies to act on this. So who do you think this needs to really come down to?
I think it's going to take a collaboration of multiple organizations, both private and public and national, to achieve, fundamentally the codes that are put in place are there for very good reasons to prevent corruption. But by nature, they have to be very generalized, and they're not really focused on the demand for these critical metals. Governments certainly can have a role, and publishing critical metal lists does seem to be encouraging some companies to focus on these elements more, but you could legislate it, but it would possibly be seen as more, interference, more guidelines to things that are already not overly popular. So certainly all of those organizations you mentioned definitely have a role, but there's also going to need to be a role of the public in it, because it comes down a lot of the time to what are investors interested in. And investors start expressing that we care about these technology metals. We want to know, what are you doing to help contribute to the supply of them? Then companies will respond because they have a duty to by the regulations, and they will start reporting on these things.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. Thanks, Rose, for putting you on the spot there with that. So Phil, with this, in terms of the reporting of the byproducts that are there, so most exploration companies, when they send those samples off for assay or for that chemical characterization, they have a lot of this information. It's just that we don't necessarily feel the need to report on that. So do you think, so even if the codes won't update, is there a different way of getting at that information, so that, for example, even just like the characterization of waste, for example, let alone what byproducts might be in there that we can use for the future? Is there something that can be done there?
It's very challenging to get hold of this information. The flow of information from mining companies into the public domain is very controlled. They have a duty to archive their geochemical data for 7 years for active deposits, but the reporting side of it is primarily through these technical reports, and the regulations on technical reports are sufficiently vague that a very minimal amount of detail is actually included. It's because they need to be interpretable by the layman who has no real knowledge of mining or geochemical processes or any of this. So there is a deliberate effort to try and keep scientific data out of it to make it more broadly understandable.
Okay.
Yeah.
It also feels as well, only having to archive this data that actually people have paid huge sums of money for, really, when you think about the whole project of going and collecting the rock in the first place, and then the actual chemical analysis. 7 years is nothing, especially when it takes 30 years to get from saying, yep, I've now got I know that there's some copper down there now let's go build the mine. 7 years just feels like a astoundingly short time horizon to say to someone you have to archive this information.
Yeah, it does seem like a short time span when you consider the average discovery to production for a mine is 15 years, and then the average mine life is 25 to 30 years. It is mainly as part of accounting. So if they need to go and review the data because someone has questions about something they have presented, or there's a takeover bid, that they can go and show this data. While 7 years is what they are mandated to do, they do hold on to this information for much longer, it forming part of their broader geological exploration programs, and it's as a result considered proprietary data for them. Their discoveries potentially leading to new discoveries in the same or different terrains.
And so final question on this, Phil, and sorry for digging into this data bit.
Right.
Is there and also earlier on in the week we did approach the area of colonialism, etc., etc. Is there a requirement to provide governments, for those countries, for example, where exploration is taking place, with these data sets? Like, do they get that granularity of data, or is that not a requirement at the moment?
No, they don't. There are, depending on the country you're in, it depends on how much they need to communicate. Most commonly, environmental reports are the key thing that gets submitted to governments, along with mining plannings for permitting, etc. But the actual geochemical data is not included in that, beyond the resource models that are already presented by the technical reports. And it is interesting you talk about the concept of colonialism regarding these sorts of things, because as I said, there is a flow of this material from less developed to more developed countries. But what I've talked about here is only a small part of it. And there are also issues regarding the technology for smelting and where that is located. And there does seem to be a real dichotomy between more developed countries having more advanced smelting technology and producing these technology elements, and less developed places having a lot more restricted access to this advanced technology. So yeah, we're importing it and they're exporting it, but it's not really an equitable distribution, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Phil. It's absolutely brilliant addition to the conversation as a whole. Round of applause for Phil Bird, everybody. Brilliant. Thank you.